G'day, team. Welcome to the State of the Industry for February 2026. I'm excited to share with you both national macro numbers as well as what's going on locally here in the Spokane Coeur d'Alene area. First, we'd be remiss if we didn't give our notices. So, first one being is we do not violate the TCPA or any other federal or state or local laws regarding calling. We just need to understand that that's just not what we do. Also, all commissions are negotiable, and we believe in fair housing and understand that the canned spam and AI disclaimers that we have here as well. All right, now let's get started. So, the first thing, if you look at it, there are three key metrics that the government and the Federal Reserve looks at with regards to indications that the economy is healthy. The first one is unemployment. And you can see here the goal is to keep unemployment under 6%. And that's considered healthy for our economy. And in fact, other than a blip during COVID where it jumped up to 8.1%, you can see that going all the way back to 2015. So literally the last 10 years, we've been able to keep unemployment under that 6% threshold. Now, if we look at what's going on monthly, going back to 2022, we saw unemployment rates get down to basically 3.5%. And understand at 3.5%, basically everyone who wants a job has one. I mean, this would really be we're fully employed. Now, we've seen things start to change a little bit and start to see a rise in unemployment. In December, we came in at 4.4. The numbers just came out today. It hasn't been updated here on the graph, but for January, unemployment ticked down a little bit to 4.3%. So all in all, still fairly healthy when it comes to unemployment. Now, the second key metric is GDP, or gross domestic product. And basically, what this says is that the goal is to have gross domestic product be at about 2% growth. And that's considered healthy. Certainly anything above that, it's all champagne and cocaine. The economy's on fire. And then, of course, anytime we have negative GDP growth, which is not considered good, and by definition, any two consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth is what we call a recession. And you can see here we had a recession in the first two quarters of 2020. Of course, again, impacted by COVID. And then, of course, once we reopened, it came roaring back and we saw that massive 33.8% growth, which again was artificial because we'd been closed for basically 6 months. We did have the first two quarters of 2022, although the government at the time said it wasn't a recession, but hey, that's their definition. This year, our numbers are a little bit skewed. There's a lot going on, right? The federal government announced the tariffs that they were going to place on imports. We saw that retailers and importers actually went ahead and imported a lot more product in the first quarter, which gave us that negative growth. And then, of course, they slowed down on the imports in the second and third quarter, which gives us this artificially high GDP growth. We don't yet know what the fourth quarter was, and we'll see that. And I think it's going to take us a little bit to see those numbers sort of get settled down so we know exactly what's going on there with regards to gross domestic product. Now, the third key metric is inflation. And you can see here the goal is 2%. That's what that pink dotted line is. And other than during the Great Recession, prior to that, we saw in 06, 07, we saw inflation start to spike up. And then, of course, when that happens, the Federal Reserve starts to raise rates. They make the cost of money more expensive, which slows down businesses and slows down borrowing, which in turn slows down the economy, and that helps bring inflation down. Now, by the way, we had that happen in 2020 through 21, where we saw inflation spike at around 5.1%. We saw the Federal Reserve raise interest rates from effectively 0 to 5.25% to 5.5%. And of course, that put the brakes on. We started to see inflation come down. However, it's not yet down to the 2% goal that the Federal Reserve has. And you can see here monthly. So we ended December with a CPI of 2.7%, which was flat from November. And we saw core CPI, which is basically the consumer price index stripped out energy and food, which tend to be more volatile. And that we saw that number come down. It's also the reason why the Fed did not lower rates when they met in January, and they maintained that, again, trying to cool the economy gently so that we don't go into a recession. And so far, they've done a pretty good job, quite frankly, in managing the inflation rate and the economy. Now, when we take a look at debt carried in this country, this is not government debt, but personal debt. You can see we have $13.5 trillion, that's with a T, tied up in mortgage debt. Now, that's a record high. I would argue that that's not necessarily a bad thing because we also have record levels of equity currently in our housing. So the one, though, below the pink line is what I would consider non-housing debt and probably a little bit more scary, for want of a better word. You can see we're at $5 trillion in non-housing debt right now. Now, that $5 trillion is made up by these four sectors. The highest is actually auto loans, and you can see we have $1.66 trillion in auto debt right now. And then that's followed closely by student loan debt at $1.65 trillion. Now, if you look at this, particularly the student loan debt, the vast majority of that debt has been accumulated over the last 10 to 12 years. So when you look at and ask yourself the question, what's the average age of those people? They're typically in their 20s to late 30s. And I believe this is part of the reason why we saw first-time home buyers for the first time ever. The average age of a first-time home buyer in 2025 was 40 years old. And we've got a lot of people saddled with a lot of student debt. The magenta line here is credit card debt, and you can see we have $1.23 trillion in credit card debt, and that probably has the steepest curve of any of these metrics right now. And then everything else, which has been relatively flat. Now, the flip side of that is personal savings. So we've got debt on one side, and then we've got how much money are we saving? And you can see here on average, in the third quarter of 25, we were down at 4.2% of disposable income was going into personal savings. Now, the numbers that you see on here are measured quarterly. When I looked at the Bureau of Economic Analysis in November, which was the most recent number, that number dropped actually to 3.9%. So again, even at the 4.2, you can see that we're in historic low territory. In fact, this graph goes back to 1947, and you can see the only other time where our savings rate was lower was back during the Great Recession. Of course, as realtors, this concerns us because, our buyers need to save for their down payments in order to get into housing. So this, again, is another metric we want to keep an eye on. Now, this here is the annual home sales going all the way back to 1990. And you can see that I've colored two groups of three in pink. And the reason that I did that is because those trajectories look very, very similar. In fact, from 06 to 08, went from 6.5 million home sales to 5 million to 4.1. And that trajectory matches what happened in 21, 22, and 23, where you went 6.1 to 5 to 4.1. So when you see the industry drop 30% over the course of 2 years, that tells me that the industry is in recession. I mean, there's no two ways about it. Now, the difference this time round versus what happened in the Great Recession was that the economy is not in recession, even though the industry is. So it doesn't feel quite the same. However, the results have been somewhat similar in terms of units. Now, when you look at what happened during the Great Recession, what you'll notice is it took 4 years of basically stagnant sales before we started to see growth again. And you can see that we're experiencing a similar thing now, where we've had now 3 years of pretty much flat growth. And when you look at this 4.06 million, which the last 2 years is what we've had, you have to actually go all the way back to 1995 in order to see that fewer home sales in this country. Now, the difference between 1995 and 2025 is that we actually have 70 million more people in this country. And I believe that this 4 million number is actually the floor now, just based on life and what happens, right? Death, divorce, debt, job changes, all of those things that impact real estate sales. There's enough of people that's going to cause at least 4 million home sales to happen each and every year. So again, forecasting what's going to happen, Personally, I believe we're going to have another year very similar. Maybe a little bit of growth, but not a lot before we start to climb back out of this. Now, you can see here home sales monthly, and these are annualized numbers. Now, the graph at the top shows what is normally the seasonal income cycle. So typically, what we've seen in the past is that sales tend to be slowest in the first quarter of the year, and then we hit the spring market and things start to really sell and through the summer, and then into the third quarter, things start to slow down, and we go into the fourth quarter, and there's usually a little bump in December as the home builders particularly try to get their product closed before the end of the year. Now, if this graph here, what you notice is that the seasonality has basically gone away. In fact, January of 2022 was the high point over the last 4 years in terms of home sales, and that number has just been flat literally for the last 3 years. Now, this graph here shows what the median home price, what's happened to that basically over the last 34, 35 years. And you can see here, the green line is what we call the trend line. And that green line represents what we have seen as an average annual rate of appreciation for residential housing in the United States, which, by the way, that rate has been 4%. So if the average appreciation was 4%, we should see those housing prices follow along on that green line. Now, by the way, all through the 90s, it did just that until 2001. And then we saw prices accelerate. And by 2006, we were actually 21% above the trend line. Were we overpriced in 2006? It certainly felt that way. And by the way, what drove that was the subprime lending situation that we had. In fact, everybody was an investor. If you could fog a mirror, you get a loan. And of course, then things corrected and we saw prices drop. And by 2011, they were significantly below where they should have been on that trend line. And then we saw appreciation kick back in again. And it sort of paralleled along until we got to 2020. And then from 2020 to 2021, it jumped up dramatically to above the trend line. And actually, last year, we ended 9% above the trend line. Now, if we only have appreciation of around 2% over the next 2 years, by the end of 27, we should end up right about where we should be at the trend line. So again, I think this is an important graph to share with your buyers and sellers because this actually shows you that it's always a great time to buy real estate, the right real estate. In fact, how many of you wish you'd actually purchased more homes in 2006 that you still owned? Because, by the way, if you'd paid over where it should have been in 2006, by 2015, you'd already got your money back. And oh, by the way, what's that property worth today, right? Probably doubled in value. Now you can see average home price each month. You can see there's a seasonality to that. It hits a high point every June, but we ended December at $405,000 was the average sales price or the median home price in the United States. Now, the other key number that has impacted us greatly is inventory. Now, what's interesting here is this blue dotted line is what we would consider to be a balanced market, which is 6 months worth of inventory. Now, I believe that it's actually a band across there. It's not exactly 6 months. It's probably somewhere between 5 and 7 months of inventory would be that balanced market. Anything less than that would be what we would consider a seller's market. Anything above that would be considered a buyer's market. Now, if you look back over the last 10 to 12 years, what you'll notice is that we've been thoroughly in that seller's market range. So it's been an interesting time. And now as we start to see inventory increase and we're moving into a balanced market, now it starts to get a very different conversation that we need to be having with buyers and sellers about how to negotiate in those markets. So you can see here, we hit the high water mark this year in June of 4.7 months, and we ended the year at 3.3, which again shows that seasonality in listings. And we should start to see those numbers come back up again as we move into the spring market. Now, new construction, based on our population and our population growth, we need about 1 million new single-family houses a year in order to house our population. Now, of course, during the Great Recession, we saw a lot of builders go out of business. We saw the builders that were able to survive through that recession actually cut back on the number of homes that they built. And consequently, we ended up with a deficit of somewhere between 3 and 5 million homes. Now, in order to make up that deficit, as you can imagine, we should be building way more than 1 million homes in order to be on track to fill that gap. And here you see the monthly annualized number, and we're certainly not doing that. In fact, we're barely building 1 million homes a year. So we're not seeing the builders building a lot of inventory, which is going to help us out. Mortgage rates, of course, which are, have a huge impact on people's ability to buy homes. And you can see here that back to 1971, if you were to average out the average interest rate over that period of time is 7.81%. Now, if we only go back to 1990, what you'll see is the average interest rate is 5.97%. And we are thoroughly bouncing around inside of that range right now. And I believe what we are seeing now is the new normal. The idea that we're going back to 3% rates, I think, is folly. And let's hope that we don't end up back where we were in 1981 at 18.6%. By the way, even back then, we were still selling houses in that high interest rate environment. We just had to be more creative about how we put transactions together. And as you can see here, the rates have just been bouncing around here fairly flat. Now, I thought this was interesting. NAR has put out a report and on their hot markets for 2026. And I thought it was interesting that Spokane made that list. And really, the reason that we're on that list is that the gap between income and house prices has narrowed. Right, we're seeing people are making more money, and house prices aren't appreciating at the same rate. So housing is much more affordable in this market. So that's a good sign for us. And why this matters to us, right, is understand that demand and activity NAR believes will improve, but not everywhere will be the same. And, even though I've been sharing with you the macro numbers, right? So this is the entire market of the United States, but real estate's a local business and it's done by local agents with their sphere of influence and their marketing image. What happens in each market will be particular to that market. So again, recovery of the market is going to be different in every market, and it certainly looks like we're in a good position here in Spokane. Now, additionally, if we do see rates drop down, what it means is it's going to mean that more buyers are going to be able to qualify to buy homes. So again, reach out to those buyers who maybe said, you know what, I'm going to sit on the fence and wait for rates to come back down. By the way, those people who believe it's going to go back to 3%, I think that they're missing out on a great opportunity because we're still seeing appreciation in the market and they're losing that appreciation. Additionally, because we're in a balanced market or somewhat balanced market, well-priced homes are still selling quickly. So having an effective pricing strategy matters more than ever because what we know is that if you just take whatever price, and what we know, right, is the sellers feel like they're holding a winning lottery ticket and they'd like to cash it in. They want to get as much money as they can for their house. And consequently, they're putting unrealistic pricing on their homes. Doesn't mean their house is not worth, it hasn't appreciated. It absolutely has. Certainly, depending on how long they've owned that property. But for a lot of them, they're unrealistic about it. And if we're not sharing with them the realities of the market and we're taking those listings at an overinflated price, one is they're going to sit on the market a lot longer and they're going to have to endure price reductions. And by the way, typically what we see in that situation is they end up selling for less than what they would have sold at if they'd actually been priced at market value from the first place. Now, additionally, inventory mix is becoming a competitive advantage, right? A lot of our mid-price range, and you'll see here, for example, in Spokane, that 350 to 450 range is where the bulk of the inventory is selling. So what are you doing to target the price points that are actually moving the quickest? And then, of course, understanding migration patterns, right? Where are the buyers coming from? Where are the sellers moving to? And have you gone and built relationships with realtors in those markets? Of course, Command allows you to go and actually do the referral map to see where most of the people are coming. And certainly what we do know is a vast majority of people who relocate to Spokane come from the Seattle market. So have you gone out and gotten purposeful about building relationships with Seattle-based agents to get those inbound referrals? And, oh, by the way, to send outbound referrals too. So let's take a look at the local numbers. And what you see here is the median home price of the red column, which is active listings. The blue is under contracts and the greens is solds. So here in Spokane County, what you see here, and this is over the last 2 years, things have been relatively flat. The average, the median sales price has actually jumped up 1% from a year ago. So it's not like they've gone down in value. They just haven't, they're not appreciating at the same level they were 3 to 4 years ago. So again, that bodes well for sellers. Now, if we look at supply and demand, what you'll notice here is that seasonality that doesn't exist nationally does exist locally. And you can see it here where during the summer, we certainly have more inventory, but guess what? We hit a low point in the winter, December typically for sales, and then they start to climb up through the summer, and then they peter off into the last fourth or in the fourth quarter of the year. Interestingly, you can see here um, inventory is actually up year over year, as are the under contracts, which bodes well. Sales are down just a little, right, down 15%. But again, we still closed 347 homes. And those 347 homes actually represent 694 transaction sides. So whatever the number is you need to hit your goals on a monthly basis, they're there. You just need to get your unfair share of that market. And this bodes well. So when we look at inventory up and under contracts up, I think of those two metrics as what I would call windshield numbers. So that's what we see as we're driving down the road. The sales are rear view mirror numbers because that's indicative of the activity that occurred 2 to 3 months ago. And we all know the average escrow is about 30 to 45 days. So it takes time for us to get our inventory closed. Now, if we look at months supply of inventory, and what you see here is that we went from 2.4 months of inventory in January of last year to 2.7 months of inventory this year. Now, what I would say is that's still solidly a seller's market. Now, what I think is interesting is that not all buyers believe that. And so it makes for the negotiations, it makes for the conversations that we have both with our sellers and with our buyers a little bit more nuanced, right? As we educate both of them about the realities of the market that we're in. And again, what this tells me is that the right price inventory is going to sell and it's probably going to sell fairly quickly. In fact, if you look at our average days on market, right now, we're at 45 days on market versus last year in January, we were at 38 days. So still relatively short market times. But as that market times increase, we just need to understand that we may have to change our strategies and our communication with our clients. So for example, if you're showing a buyer a listing that has been on the market for 50 days, does that mean there's something wrong with that listing? And of course, the answer is no. It just means that that's average, right? So educating our buyers about that. By the way, if we're going to have our inventory, our sellers be on the market for longer periods of time, what are we doing about being proactive and purposeful about communicating on a regular basis, like a weekly cadence, for example, with our sellers, so that during that period of time, they're not feeling left out and falling through the cracks? Now, if we look at Stevens County, interestingly, prices across the board have gone up, both active inventory under contracts and solds. So again, that bodes well for Stevens County. Now, in terms of supply and demand, again, we see the seasonality, although the numbers are down year over year, but not significantly. It's just a smaller pool out there. 173 active listings last month, 23 went under contract, and we closed 16 homes. So, a change of one makes a difference, right, when those numbers are so small. If we look at months supply of inventory, what you see there has been a significant increase, right, and that's that inventory. What you see there, and of course, market times have probably gone up to cause this. In fact, you'll see that they have. But we went from a seller's market of 3.3 months of inventory to what is solidly a balanced market, 5.8 months of inventory in Stevens County. And then, of course, as I mentioned, days on market, they've gone from 68 days to 88 days on market. Now, cross over the border into Idaho, Kootenai County, and what you'll see there again, pricing has been fairly flat. There's been some appreciation. The median list price, $650,000, that's down from a year ago, which I think what that indicates to me is we're actually getting better about pricing our real estate. Although what you will notice is the pendings are up 20,000, and oh, by the way, so are the sales are up 32,000. So again, that bodes well for people who own real estate in Kootenai County. Supply and demand, again, we have the seasonality showing up. 62 active listings in Kootenai County last month. 45 went under contract, and we closed 206 of them. Still solid activity. In fact, the number of closed units is actually up slightly, even though the other metrics are down. If we look at month supply of inventory, went from 3.4 months to 3.1 months. So again, not a huge amount of movement there year over year. Although this is fascinating, and that is the days on market have gone from 120 days on market in January of last year to now being only 55 days on market. So again, having this data should help you educate your buyers and your sellers on the realities of the market. Now, as I mentioned earlier, right, understanding what price point you should be looking at and working in. And you can see here, this is the total market overview for Greater Spokane, single family residences only. And what you'll notice here is that a big chunk of the closed units happen between 350 and 450,000. And then it sort of drops off a bit. You see there's still activity in the upper end. So again, I would encourage you to think about what price points do you want to be focused on, and then what do you need to do purposely in order to make that happen. Now, I think this is fascinating. There are 2,366 realtors in SAR, in the Spokane Association of Realtors. Now, of those 2,366, 612 closed 0 deals in the last 12 months. 812, by the way, only did 1 to 4 deals, right? So, by the way, that's about a third of the population has done, well, actually more than a third, almost half the population have done less than 4 transactions in the last 12 months. I would argue that's not a career worth having. Now, what I find really fascinating is what you'll see is here over 100, only two agents have closed over 100 transactions. And in fact, only 10 agents have closed over 50 in the entire market, which puts you in the top 0.4% of all realtors if you've closed 50 or more deals. If you close 30 or more, you're in the top 3%. If you close 20 or more, you're in the top 7%. And if you've closed 10 or more transactions, you're actually basically in the top 20% of all realtors in Spokane. And by the way, there's no reason that you shouldn't be in that group because there are more than enough transactions in order for you to do that number. This is just about you getting your unfair share of the market. Now, I've included this and I want you to see this is available to you through NAR and their website. But I want to just sort of quickly share with you some of the demographics and data that is available. And this is updated each month for you. And you can see here, I've got Spokane Valley, because we are one of the 100 largest metro areas in the country. And so we have access to this data. So you can see here, it's got housing statistics, listings, sales, pricing. You've got equity gains in Spokane over 10 years. And then, of course, new construction. The impact, how many people can actually afford to buy the median priced home if we see interest rates at 7% or alternatively at 6%. This is based on a 10% down payment. So basically, if we see rates fall from 7% to 6%, there'll be 9,500 more households could afford the median priced home, right? And basically 10% typically will buy, and that would be another 950 transactions. So have you reached out and talked to your people to let them know that, hey, if we see rates drop down to 6%, they should understand that their ability to buy will be much greater. You've got housing affordability statistics. We've got income statistics for the market, along with mortgage applications, and then distribution of where those loans are by age group, as well as what type of loans that are being done. You can see the vast majority of loans in Spokane are conventional, and you can see the average interest rate right now, the bulk of them are between 6 and 7.5%. And then, of course, we have economic conditions. So you can see our GDP growth in Spokane is about 3.1%, which is solid. Job growth is 0.4%, so just barely growing. And that's been flat for a couple of years, you can see here in this graph. But wage growth, however, has gone up 3.8%. So, and again, that's why that gap is closing and why NAR believes the Spokane market's going to be a pretty solid market in 2026. And then unemployment is right around average at 4.4%. Again, you look at the racial ethnic group makeup of Spokane, and you can see that's by age group, gender, where they've moved. Again, the vast majority have moved within state, and their income ranges as well as their education. And then the age of the home, the year built, the median property value of 382,000 in Spokane and Spokane Valley. And of course, 71% of recent buyers purchased their home with financing. So what that says is the rest basically paid cash, right? Which would be about 29%. And the type of housing that they purchased, the bulk of them were single family detached homes. Home ownership demographics, along with a home ownership rate by income level and ethnicity, along with the demographics of the area. So, there are 237 households and the median age is 52. By the way, I mean, they're getting to an age where we're going to start to see more turnover as that group ages. And then I wanted to share this with you. So these QR codes, this QR code here will take you to this dashboard, so you can go there. And then this QR code will take you to the Housing Hotspots report that NAR did. So I want to encourage you to take advantage of that data. All right. Well, I hope this information was helpful for you. My plan is to do this for you every month. And look for this in your inbox from Andrea. And if you've got any questions about any of the data here, by all means, don't hesitate to reach out to me. It would be my pleasure to answer any questions you have. Thanks again for tuning in, and have a great day. Take care now. Bye.